The Comet Line was a logistical wonder, a 1,200-mile human escape hatch built on nerve and string. Every few hundred miles, the system had to reset, passing the airmen to the next set of hands who risked their lives the moment they opened their front door. The journey began in Brussels. Airmen, often injured, sometimes still in their tattered uniforms, were quickly outfitted with false papers and civilian clothes by a father, Frédéric de Jongh. He was a school principal, codenamed Paul, who ran the operational side from their home on Avenue Émile Verhaeren. Here, in the living room of a modest Belgian townhouse, young men who had been flying bombing missions over Germany just days earlier would sit drinking ersatz coffee, learning to walk like Belgians, to keep their hands in their pockets like Europeans, to stop the American habit of looking people directly in the eye. But the mathematics of rescue were brutal, and everyone knew it. If an airman was captured, the outcome followed a predictable script: interrogation at a Luftwaffe facility, transport to a prisoner of war camp, years behind barbed wire, eating thin soup and counting days until liberation. It was brutal and soul-crushing, but it was survivable. The Geneva Conventions still meant something, even to the Third Reich. Captured aviators had status. They were combatants, soldiers, protected by international law. But for the civilians who sheltered them, there was no such protection. The Gestapo did not recognize resistance networks as military organizations. They were saboteurs, terrorists, enemies of the Reich operating outside the laws of war. When the Germans uncovered a safe house, they didn't simply arrest the occupants, they destroyed them. Public executions were standard. Torture was routine. Entire families could vanish overnight. Mothers, fathers, children sent to camps where survival was measured in weeks, not years. In France, harboring an Allied airman carried an automatic death sentence. In Belgium, the same. The Nazi calculus was coldly efficient. They make the price of resistance so catastrophic that ordinary people would choose self-preservation over heroism every single time. And it worked. Mostly. British intelligence understood the cost with grim precision. MI9, the division responsible for escape and evasion, had analyzed the data early in the war. For every airman successfully returned to England through an organized network, an average of 4 to 6 civilians would eventually be captured and killed. The networks, by their very nature, left trails that the Gestapo could follow. Safe houses had addresses, forgers had workshops, guides had faces, names, patterns of movement. The Germans were patient, methodical, willing to let a network operate for months while they mapped its entire structure, identifying every link in the chain. Then they would strike all at once, coordinated raids across hundreds of miles, rolling up entire resistance cells in a single night. The rational choice, from a pure cost-benefit analysis, was undeniable. Don't build the networks at all. Tell downed airmen to hide in barns, to wait out the war in attics and root cellars, to avoid creating the paper trail and human connections that would inevitably lead the Gestapo to entire communities of resistors. Better to let the aviators worsen in occupied territory than condemn whole families to Ravensbrück and Mauthausen. But Andrée de Jongh didn't make rational choices. She was 24 years old when she decided to build the Comet Line. Not a military officer, not an intelligence operative. She was a commercial artist and a nurse. She had grown up in a comfortable middle-class home in Brussels, the daughter of a respected educator. a young woman whose expected trajectory involved marriage and children and a quiet life in a city that had already endured one German occupation during the Great War. Instead, she chose to walk armed soldiers through the most heavily militarized zone in human history. The audacity of this decision cannot be overstated. In August 1941, when Andrée made her first crossing, Europe was a fortress. The Third Reich controlled everything from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. Every border was sealed. Every train station was monitored. Papers were checked constantly, randomly, at checkpoints and in cafes and on street corners. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, resentful neighbors, collaborators seeking favor with the occupiers, professional denouncers who made their living turning in Jews and resistors for cash bounties that could feed a family for months. And into this surveillance state, Andrée proposed to walk British and American airmen, men who spoke no French, who didn't know the price of bread or the name of the Belgian king, who would instinctively reach for a cigarette with their left hand when Europeans used their right, who would panic at a checkpoint or make eye contact with a German soldier in a way that screamed foreigner. She called herself Dédé among her inner circle. But to the airmen and the broader network, she was known by a code name that perfectly captured the absurd simplicity of her method. The Postman. Because that's exactly what she did. She delivered packages, human packages, from one end of Nazi-occupied Europe to the other, as if she were carrying mail. The concept was revolutionary precisely because it rejected every principle of organized resistance that British intelligence had been teaching. Most networks tried to fragment their operations, to isolate cells so that no single member knew more than their immediate contacts. The idea was to limit exposure, to ensure that if one link broke, the entire chain wouldn't shatter. Andrée's approach was the opposite. She didn't hide her cargo in secret compartments or smuggle them across borders in false-bottomed trucks. She walked them through checkpoints in broad daylight, arm in arm like she was escorting cousins to visit relatives in the countryside. She took them on trains where German soldiers sat 3 seats away, their rifles propped against their knees. She guided them through Paris in groups of 3 or 4, young men in borrowed civilian suits walking past Nazi headquarters on Avenue Foch, as if they had every right to be there, as if the idea of them being fugitives was absurd. The scale of what she was attempting defied all logic. From Brussels to the Spanish border was roughly 800 miles as the crow flies, but the actual route was far longer. It snaked through occupied Belgium, crossed into northern France, wound through the endless German checkpoints that separated the military zones, then continued south through Vichy France, nominally unoccupied, but crawling with collaborationist police who handed resistors to the Gestapo with enthusiasm. And finally, the route led to the foothills of the Pyrenees. The mountains themselves added another layer of impossibility. The Pyrenees aren't the Alps. They're lower in elevation, but they're meaner, rockier, fewer established passes, and more vertical ascents that required climbing, not hiking. The routes the Comet Line used demanded crossing at altitudes above 8,000 feet, through snow and fog that could descend without warning, over trails that were barely trails at all. These were centuries-old smugglers' paths, routes that could vanish entirely in bad weather or under fresh snowfall. The Spanish border itself was patrolled by German units on the French side, hunting for escapees and resistors, and Franco's Guardia Civil on the Spanish side, who had orders to arrest anyone crossing illegally. Spain was a fascist dictatorship, theoretically neutral but deeply sympathetic to the Axis. Even reaching Spanish soil didn't guarantee safety. The airmen still had to be moved to Madrid, then transferred south to Gibraltar, the British territory at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula, where officials could finally confirm their identities and arrange transport back to England. The entire journey, from the moment a downed airman knocked on Frederick de Jongh's door in Brussels to the moment he boarded a plane in Gibraltar, took between 3 and 6 weeks. 3 to 6 weeks of constant exposure, of checkpoint after checkpoint, of sleeping in safe houses that might be raided at any moment, of trusting strangers with your life because you had no other choice. And Andrée walked it, over and over and over again, not once, not twice. She personally escorted airmen on this route 33 times over the course of 2.5 years, guiding more than 100 Allied aviators out of occupied Europe before her eventual capture in January 1943. 33 times she stood at German checkpoints with forged identity papers and a borrowed smile, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, while a Wehrmacht soldier examined her documents with suspicious eyes. She climbed those mountains in the dark, the airmen stumbling behind her in borrowed shoes that didn't fit, their breath coming in ragged gasps in the thin mountain air. Completely dependent on her judgment about which path to take, which ridge to follow, when to move and when to hide. She gambled that the Gestapo would see a young woman travelling with male companions and think absolutely nothing of it. Because what kind of resistance operative would be so brazen, so visible, so utterly unbothered by the machinery of surveillance built specifically to catch people like her? And the genius of it, the reason it worked for as long as it did, was that it relied on a single profound miscalculation by German intelligence. The Nazis simply could not believe that a young civilian woman would be running a strategic military operation. Their reports, when they eventually pieced together the Comet Line's existence, kept describing the Postman as a man. The code name itself suggested masculinity, and their assumptions did the rest, because the alternative was unthinkable within their framework. Women could be informants, certainly. They could be couriers carrying messages between male operatives. They might even be forgers sitting in back rooms creating false documents. But a woman leading armed soldiers through 1,000 miles of occupied territory? Impossible. So they looked for the man behind her. They assumed Andrée was a front, a distraction, and a pretty face meant to draw attention away from the real organizer. Somewhere in the shadows, they believed, was the actual commander, the military mind orchestrating the entire operation. They never stopped looking for him. The Comet Line would eventually move more than 800 airmen to safety, making it one of the most successful escape networks of the entire war. And it all began with Andrée de Jongh, deciding that if young men could fall out of the sky over Belgium, she could walk them back out again, one impossible step at a time. But Andrée didn't walk those 1,000 miles alone. The Comet Line was never a one-woman operation, no matter how much the legend tends to focus on the Postman herself. It was an industrial-scale rescue machine built on trust and the willingness of hundreds of ordinary people to risk everything for strangers they would never see again. At the center of the Brussels operation was Frédéric, André's father. He was 53 years old in 1941, a school principal with the careful mind of an educator and the organizational instincts of someone who had spent decades managing people and resources. While André walked the line, Frédéric ran it from their home on Avenue Émile Verhaeren. He coordinated the intake of new arrivals, managed the forgers who produced false identity documents, arranged safe houses across the city, and handled the finances. Because running an escape line required money, significant money. They needed to pay for train tickets, for food, for bribes at checkpoints, for the mountain guides who charged exorbitant fees to risk their lives leading strangers over the Pyrenees. Frédéric kept coded records, tracking which airmen had arrived, which had been passed to the next stage, which routes were still safe, and which had been compromised. He was organized to the point of obsession because a single mistake, one name written in the wrong ledger, one address remembered incorrectly, could unravel the entire network. And he knew that every airman who passed through his living room represented a death sentence waiting to be discovered. But he never hesitated. He simply did the work. Then there were the safe house operators, almost all of them women. Women like Elvire de Grief, codenamed Tante Go, or Aunt Go, who ran the southern terminus of the line from her home in Anglet, near the Spanish border. She was a middle-aged mother of two, who turned her house into a way station for dozens of airmen, feeding them, clothing them, and arranging their mountain crossings. Her husband, Fernand, worked with her, but it was Elvira who managed the operation with fierce efficiency. She knew every smuggler in the region, every corrupt Spanish border guard who could be bribed, every safe route through the foothills. When André arrived with a group of airmen, exhausted from the journey south, it was Elvire who made sure they had one final hot meal before the mountains, who checked their boots and gave them warmer coats, who looked them in the eyes and told them they would make it. There was also Catalin Aguirre, a Basque woman who lived in Urugne, right at the base of the Pyrenees. Her farmhouse became a staging point for the crossings. Airmen would arrive after dark, rest for a few hours, and then begin the climb. Catalin fed them, hid them when German patrols came too close, and never once asked for payment or recognition. In Paris, there was Germaine Tillion, an anthropologist who ran a safe house network and helped coordinate the passage of airmen through the city. There was Nadine Dumont, just 16 years old when she started working as a courier, carrying messages between cells because a teenage girl on a bicycle attracted far less attention than a grown man. And there were dozens more. Factory workers who hid airmen in storage rooms, farmers who let them sleep in barns, people who had no training, no reason to believe they could outsmart the Gestapo, but who decided that doing nothing was worse than the risk of doing something. The Comet Line worked because it was a web, not a chain. If one person was arrested, the others could adapt, reroute, and continue. But that resilience came at a cost. It required constant communication and constant trust. Every new person brought into the network was a potential weak link, a possible informant, someone who might break under interrogation. And yet, they kept recruiting. They kept expanding. Because the airmen kept coming. But the most dangerous part of the entire operation, the segment where the most lives were lost, was the Pyrenees crossing itself. This was the climax of the journey, the final test that separated survival from capture. And it was brutal. The crossings happened at night, always at night. The guides, mostly Basque smugglers who had been running contraband over these mountains for generations, would arrive at the safe house after dark. They were hard men, weather-beaten and silent, who knew every goat path and hidden ravine in the range. They charged enormous fees, sometimes as much as 50,000 francs per person, because they understood the stakes. If they were caught guiding Allied soldiers, they would be shot immediately. No trial, no camp, just a bullet in the back of the head and a shallow grave in the mountains. The most famous of these guides was a man named Florentino Goicoechea, a Basque shepherd who made more than 200 crossings over the course of the war. He was short, stocky, with hands like iron and legs that could climb for 12 hours without rest. He didn't speak much French and almost no English, but he didn't need to. His job was simple: get them over the mountains alive. Andrée made the crossing with him dozens of times. She trusted him completely, which in the world of the Comet Line was the highest compliment you could give. The airmen who attempted the crossing were rarely in good shape. Many were injured from their bailouts, broken bones that had been hastily set. They had been living on the run for weeks, sleeping rough, eating whatever they could scrounge. They were exhausted and now being asked to climb a mountain range in the dead of winter. The route typically used by the Comet Line crossed near the peak of La Rune, a mountain that rises just over 2,900 feet. That doesn't sound extreme compared to the Alps, but the Pyrenees are deceptive. The landscape is steep, with loose scree that could send you tumbling hundreds of feet if you lost your footing. The weather could turn in minutes, fog rolling in so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. And they had to do it in silence, absolute silence. German patrols regularly swept the lower slopes. Spanish border guards watched the crossing points. A single shout, a dislodged rock clattering down the mountainside, any of it could bring soldiers running. So they climbed in the dark, following Florentino or whichever guide was leading them that night, moving single file along paths that were sometimes only a foot wide, sheer drops on either side. The airmen clutched at rocks and roots, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their legs shaking from exhaustion. Andrée moved among them like a ghost, checking on the ones who were struggling, whispering encouragement, helping them over the worst sections. She carried extra water, extra food, bandages for the inevitable cuts and scrapes. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, but she had made this crossing so many times that she knew every treacherous section, every place where someone might freeze up in fear. Patrols passing so close they could hear the German soldiers talking, having to lie flat on freezing ground for an hour while a searchlight swept back and forth across the valley below. Airmen panicking, wanting to turn back, having to be physically restrained from bolting. And there were casualties, men who fell and broke legs, who had to be left behind because carrying them would doom everyone. Men who simply gave up, sat down on the trail and refused to move, their minds broken by fear and exhaustion. A few who were caught by patrols and shot on the spot, but most made it. Most followed Andrée and the guides over the peaks, down the Spanish side, to the village of Oyarzun, or Renteria, where Spanish sympathizers would hide them briefly before moving them on to the British consulate in San Sebastian. The crossing typically took between 8 and 12 hours, depending on weather and the condition of the airmen. When they finally reached Spanish soil, some of the men would collapse, sobbing with relief. Others would simply stand there, numb, unable to process that they had actually survived. Andrée never celebrated. She would make sure they were safely handed off to the next link in the chain, rest for perhaps a day, and then turn around and walk back over the mountains to France. Back into occupied territory. Back to the beginning to start the entire process again with a new group of airmen. She did this 33 times. 33 times she rolled the dice with her life. But the laws of probability are merciless. And in January 1943, her luck finally ran out. The capture didn't happen because of a mistake Andrée made. It happened because the Gestapo had been patient and relentless. They had been tracking the Comet Line for months, following leads, interrogating captured members, slowly mapping the network. On January 15, 1943, Andrée was betrayed. A Belgian collaborator, working as an informant for the Germans, had infiltrated the network and identified several key members. German forces raided multiple locations simultaneously across Belgium and France. Andrée was arrested near the town of Unarmed, close to the Spanish border, along with several airmen she was preparing to guide over the mountains. She was carrying false papers, but the Germans knew exactly who she was. They had been looking for the Postman for over a year. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Paris, interrogated, tortured. The Gestapo wanted names. They still believed she was a subordinate, that somewhere above her was a male commander running the operation. She told them nothing. Even under torture, even when they made it clear that her silence would cost her everything, she protected her network. She gave them nothing they could use. Her father, Frederick, was arrested 2 months later in a separate raid. He was sent to a concentration camp and executed in March 1944, shot in the courtyard of Gross Rosen camp. He was 56 years old. Andrée was sent first to Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, and then later transferred to Mauthausen. She survived both, though barely. She endured starvation, forced labor, disease, and the constant presence of death. But she survived, and crucially, the Comet Line survived her arrest. That was the brilliance of the network's design. When Andrée was captured, others stepped up. The safe houses remained operational. The guides continued their crossings. New couriers took over the routes Andrée had walked. The line adapted, reorganized, and kept moving airmen out of occupied Europe until the very end of the war. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Comet Line had saved 773 Allied airmen. Of those 773, Andrée personally guided 118 before her capture in January 1943. 118 men who owed their lives to a 24-year-old Belgian woman who decided that the impossible was worth attempting. The cost was staggering. Of the roughly 3,000 people who worked for the Comet Line during the war, more than 800 were arrested. Many were executed. Many more died in concentration camps. The 4 to 6 civilian casualties per rescued airman that Mi-9 had predicted proved grimly accurate. But those 773 airmen returned to their squadrons. They flew more missions. They shortened the war, even if only by a small margin. And they went home to families who had thought they were dead. When the war ended, Andrée was liberated from Mauthausen by American forces. She weighed less than 90 pounds. She was sick, traumatized, barely recognizable as the young woman who had started the Comet Line 4 years earlier. She returned to Belgium. She was offered medals, honors, official recognition. The British government wanted to decorate her. The Belgian government wanted to make her a national hero. She refused almost all of it. Andrée didn't want parades. She didn't want her photograph in newspapers. She had never done it for recognition, and she wasn't going to start seeking it now. She did accept one honor, the George Medal from Britain and the Légion d'honneur from France, but only because refusing them entirely would have been seen as an insult to the airmen she had saved and the people who had died alongside her. After the war, Andrée moved to Africa. She spent decades working as a nurse in leper colonies in Ethiopia and the Belgian Congo, far from the spotlight, far from the speeches and ceremonies that she found unbearable. She treated patients, saved lives in a different way, and lived quietly. She rarely spoke about the war. When journalists tracked her down requesting interviews, she usually declined. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't lecture. She simply continued the work she had always done, helping people who needed help, expecting nothing in return. The Comet Line's work was gradually recognized over the decades that followed. Historians pieced together. The network's operations interviewed survivors, traced the routes. Monuments were erected. Streets were named after key members. The guides like Florentino Goicoechea were honored. And eventually, inevitably, the spotlight found Andrée again. In 1985, she was invited to a reunion of the airmen she had saved. Dozens of them traveled to Brussels from America, Britain, Canada, Australia. Men in their 60s and 70s, many of whom hadn't seen Andrée since she had guided them over the Pyrenees more than 40 years earlier. They wanted to thank her. They wanted to tell her what their lives had been like, the careers they'd built, all because she had walked them out of occupied Europe when they were terrified young men who thought they were going to die. She attended. She listened to their stories. And she cried, not from pride, but from grief, because she was thinking about all the ones who hadn't made it, the airmen who had been captured, the members of the network who had died in camps, her father who had been executed for doing the same work she had done. Andrée died on October 13, 2007, in Brussels. She was 90 years old. Her obituary ran in newspapers around the world, finally telling the full story of the young woman who had built one of World War II's most successful escape lines. But the most fitting tribute came from one of the airmen she had saved, an American pilot named Martin Scherlinger, who had been shot down over Belgium in 1943. He had been guided by Andrée from Brussels to the Pyrenees, had climbed those mountains with her walking beside him in the dark, whispering encouragement every time he stumbled. At her funeral, he stood at the podium and said something simple, something that captured everything about who Andrée had been. He said, "She saved his life." And then she went back and saved 100 more. Not because she was ordered to, not because it was her duty, but because she decided that one person acting with courage could change the world. And she was right. The war is filled with close escapes, and we have only scratched the surface of the incredible characters found in this era. If you want to keep seeing these untold stories of World War II, then like this video, share it, and hit subscribe to join us for the next account of heroism.